Story 1. Back in my university days, we had a long summer holiday, and in the United Kingdom, most students got a job to top up their bank accounts for the next year. At the end of my second year studying chemistry, I got a job as a quality controller in a food factory. One thing I really learned from that job was what foods to avoid. Did you know that one of the ingredients in canned tomato soup is concentrated hydrochloric acid? Anyway, I was significantly more qualified in chemistry than the quality supervisor. After I pointed out some issues with how they were conducting certain tests in the lab, I was moved to the cannery, where I was instructed to check the seams on the cans after they were sealed, the vacuum in the cans, and also ensure that the checkware was functioning correctly. It was the checkware where things got interesting. If the volume of products in each can was too high, the cans could burst during cooking. If it was too low, the company could be fined for underweight products. I was shown how to check and adjust the volumes going into each can. It really wasn't difficult. One day, while observing the production and canning of chicken soup, I noticed the line was running just a little light, not below the minimum, but just on the lower compliance level. So, I adjusted the machine to add just a little more soup to the cans. This brought the weight up to almost the exact amount expected per can. Things ran smoothly from that point onward until we reached the end of the run. There was a flurry of activity in the cannery supervisor's office, with much pointing at paperwork. It seems the cannery had produced around 100 fewer cans than expected. Cue the investigation. It turns out that by stopping the line from running light and ensuring the cans were labeled with the correct weight, I had cost them 100 cans of soup. I was told under no circumstances should I make any adjustments to any production line, and that I must find a supervisor. Fine, I was only there as a temp, after all. Everything was fine for about a week, and then came the mushroom soup run. Once again, the line was running as close to the minimum as possible, and then I noticed cans coming through the checkware underweight. I told the guy running the line, and he said to just adjust it. This is where the quality control supervisor stepped in. No, I couldn't adjust it, but since I was responsible for quality control, I couldn't let this run underweight. Cue pressing the big red button, stopping the canning line. Canneries are noisy places, with conveyors running, cans clattering against each other, and then into the retort baskets where they are cooked. All of this stopped, and I had the entire room standing around, wondering what to do. I asked one of the line staff to go and find a supervisor to make the adjustments, and I waited. We waited for almost an hour to find someone, by which time the soup that needed to be canned had gone cold and couldn't be pumped through the canning machines and had to be discarded. The supervisor arrived and was extremely upset, dragging me into the factory manager's office. He told the story of the lost 100 cans and how I had now cost them a whole batch of mushroom soup. The manager started shouting at me and then made a rather striking statement. "I can't see you having a career in this industry. You need to think about your options." My response was quite blunt, I must admit. Clearly, your margins are dependent on getting as close to producing an underweight can of soup as possible. I understand that and sought only to protect you from potential litigation under consumer protection laws. I was told not to do that and to find a supervisor to make any changes. In the absence of one for over an hour, I was faced with two options, either halt production or allow underweight cans to leave the cannery. My career options are not guided by my temporary summer holiday job, and I aspire to something more fulfilling. As I will be returning to university in a few weeks, I'm gonna get changed, and you can find someone else to check your cannery production. Goodbye. Story 2. I run a satellite office for the company I work for, with the headquarters located about 20 minutes away. I was required to be at the headquarters once, maybe twice, a week. At some point, the headquarters implemented a visitor badge policy for all visitors, which is a standard practice for many office visits. However, there were a couple of key differences. First, I was never considered a visitor prior to this event since I work for the company. Second, my uniform is extremely unique. It would be easier to get a police uniform than one of mine, much easier. On my first visit after the new policy, I was told by the receptionist that all visitors must wear a badge, and it must remain visible at all times. Fine, I can do that. I didn't give her any attitude because she was only doing her job, so I wore the badge clipped to my long goatee. The next week, I wore the badge clipped to my ear. The week after, I attached it to the top of my shoe on the laces. The week after that, I clipped it to the back of my collar. This continued for about 2 months. It got to the point where employees would see me and ask, "Where is it this time?" I had fun with it and never expressed any protest. After the 2-month mark, I went in, signed in, and awaited my badge. The receptionist said, while laughing, "Oh, you don't get a badge anymore." I smiled, shrugged, said thank you, and went on my way. 2 years later, still no badge. Story 3. I work with computers at my day job, so I type very quickly. When I was a cashier, I was also incredibly fast, which was a bonus during the holiday season with the long lines. I could go through my line of customers quickly and even call over customers from other registers. The salesmen, and yes, they were all men working on commission, were too important to ring up their own sales or to have their customers wait in line, so they would cut ahead of all the other customers who had been waiting. I would apologize profusely to those who had waited, then have to stop and ring up the commission sales. But the inconvenience wasn't enough. I got attitude when asking for their employee number to properly input the sale into the register. "You should know that you've done it before." Well, yes, about 3 months ago on a busy Saturday, and it didn't occur to me to memorize other people's employee numbers. So I just rang it up using my number. And for the next 20 or so transactions, they continued to cut in line to have me ring them up. A week went by, and I received my paycheck, which was huge. As it turned out, that previous weekend, during the holiday season, the store had a promotion where employees received an extra $1 for every $100 they rang up. I had processed about $35,000 in sales that week. I did get a stern talking to about ringing up commission items without being a commission employee, and that they didn't have a way to pay me for those commissions because I was hourly. I then explained how I had been forced to ring up the sales for that department and how they had cut in line to make me do so. The commission guys were extremely upset, and I understand they needed their pay, and selling suits isn't easy. I wasn't trying to take their money, but the store policy was that they were supposed to ring up their own sales. The managers asked if I could identify which sales belonged to which employees, but I honestly couldn't. It had been so busy, and there were so many transactions that I couldn't remember from a week before. So, the store came up with a rough solution. They added up all the commission sales done on my register without an employee number assigned and split it evenly among the sales staff in that department. Maybe not fair, but better than no paycheck at all for those guys or giving it all to me. However, the store did let me keep the bonus for ringing in the sales, so the salesmen ended up losing out on multiple fronts, and they never came to my register to ring up anything again. That was enough for me. Story 4. For a while, when I was a kid and eventually a teenager, I lived in a small town in the middle of nowhere. The heart and soul of this town was the local library, run by an amazing lady named Hannah. Hannah understood that the town was rural and poor, and she did everything in her power to cater to the town's residents. There was no after-school program for the elementary school, so Hannah opened the doors of the library, even though the building was incredibly small. The nearest movie theater was miles away. This took place when Netflix was only a DVD service and expensive for this town. So Hannah made sure the library had a huge selection of VHS tapes and DVDs. Hannah would listen to us avid readers when we wanted to read a particular book and buy it. If the book was part of a series, she would buy the whole series. Hannah also started a summer program that would have rivaled the free summer programs of any large town, and she did so much more. Unfortunately, Hannah's mother got sick, and she had to move back home, halfway across the country. The library board hired a woman named Ruth Derriere. The board believed that since Mrs. Derriere was from a town or two away, she would be a good fit for our community. Mrs. Derriere, however, was not good for the library. Mrs. Derriere decided to purge all of the books and items from the library that she deemed impure, such as The Lord of the Rings, the entire manga section, non-religious self-help books, and the majority of the media collection. Mrs. Derriere also reinstated library fines, including the fines that should have been collected years prior, but that Hannah had never cared about. Mrs. Derriere also demanded that everyone under the age of 18 address her as Mrs. Derriere instead of Ruth because of respect. These were only a few of the things Mrs. Derriere did. To say the library fell apart quickly after Mrs. Derriere took charge would be a massive understatement. I loved the library and felt personally attacked, so I started a campaign to save it. I begged, pleaded, and complained to my mother until she joined the library board and eventually became the board president. My mom was able to put a stop to Mrs. Derriere's purging. I learned how to operate the library's very basic website to make interlibrary loans and taught others to do so, enabling us to read entire series and so on. Mrs. Derriere knew what I was doing and hated me for it, but I continued anyway. The only thing Mrs. Derriere could hold over me by the end was that I was under 18, and my mom had taught me to respect others, so I referred to her as Mrs. Derriere. However, on my 18th birthday, a Saturday, I woke up early, got dressed, grabbed the books I needed to return, and walked happily to the library. I waited in line as Mrs. Derriere berated a few elementary school kids for returning books late and revoked a little old lady's right to use the library computers because she asked too many questions. When it was finally my turn at the counter, I said loudly and clearly, "Good morning, Ruth." All the color drained from Ruth's face, and then it turned extraordinarily red. Before she could try to berate me, I quickly added, "It's my 18th birthday today." As news and stories do in small towns, what I had done spread quickly. It soon became a tradition for everyone turning 18 to visit the library on their birthday and greet Ruth. The tradition continued even after I moved away, until Ruth quit several years later for reasons I do not know. Story 5. This sub reminded me of a personal experience at a large desktop and laptop supplier, among other information technology services. This was about 15 years ago, and I imagine most of this work has now been outsourced to low-wage countries. The name of the company consists of 3 capital letters. They no longer sell consumer hardware. My job was to screen hardware issues with desktop and laptop computers, mostly laptops. A person would call customer service, their problems would be documented, and I would review the ticket, call the person if there were any uncertainties, and then write up a plan for an on-site engineer to follow. If I determined the problem to be the memory, but it ended up being the motherboard, this would be considered a return case, and we were strictly monitored on those. We were expected to handle about 20 to 25 cases per day and only have 1 or 2 return cases. Here's the thing, though, I easily handled 30 to 40 cases per day. I did this for about 8 months, and then I started to receive negative feedback from my manager. He said my return cases were too high. Most of the time, these were within an acceptable range, but occasionally there would be 3 or 4 per day. The fact that I processed nearly double the cases I was expected to handle was never mentioned. After receiving this feedback twice, I decided to change my daily routine. I logged onto my phone, went for coffee, and chatted for about an hour. I then completed maybe 15 cases until lunch. After lunch, I took another coffee break, browsed some game strategy guides, did some online courses or reading, completed the remaining 5 to 10 cases, and then went home. Now, I did the mandatory 20 to 25 cases per day and just left it at that. Fewer cases meant fewer mistakes. Problem solved. I was then complimented by my manager for managing to reduce my return cases to only 1 per day on average. Of course, this job quickly became boring and offered no future prospects, so I left not long after. But I'll always remember this experience and vowed never to work at such companies again. Story 6. A long time ago, I worked for a leasing company. We leased anything from manufacturing equipment to jets, but our main business was computers. One fine day, a customer called in and found that their usual salesman was on vacation. They didn't like that one bit, and after being told that no, they would not be given the number to his hotel in Aruba, they were passed on to Tommy. Tommy was the new guy, but in a good way. A customer would ask for something, and he'd spend 2 days reading white papers, benchmarks, and calling vendors to find the answer himself, even when there was someone fully knowledgeable in that technology just a few cubicles away. Anyway, the customer wanted 16 workstations in a HurrySG i-Octane dual processor with 128 MB video cards, 4 GB of memory, and monitors. They didn't care how much it cost. They just needed them as soon as possible. Tommy told them he'd call back in an hour because he needed to speak to the vendors. The first vendor said it would take at least 3 weeks since they were out of stock. The second vendor said it would take 2 weeks and cost 20% more since they would have to upgrade existing systems. SGI themselves quoted 3 weeks. For the first time in his life, Tommy remembered that we had a former executive from SGI on staff. He called him, begging for a contact that might speed things up. The executive said, "How about today? We have 20 of them in the warehouse." Sure, they're supposed to go to another customer, but that won't be for another 2 months. We can play some games with serial numbers on the lease after the replacements come in. Tommy thanked him and called the customer back. The customer answered and said, "It's been almost 2 hours. Next time, don't promise a deadline you can't meet." "Yeah, I know, and I'm sorry. I had to work pretty hard to track down what you need. And, well, I've got some good news and some bad news." "You called the first vendor." "Yep, they can't get them to you for 3 weeks." "Did you call any other vendors?" "The second vendor wants a markup, but can have it in 2 weeks. I also spoke with." "What about the manufacturer?" "I called them too. They also wanted 3 weeks. But we have." "How much of a markup does the second vendor want?" 20%, but that doesn't matter because." "Go ahead and order them." "You haven't even heard the—" "If I never hear another word out of your mouth, it will be too soon. Just get it ordered, and I expect paperwork by 8 a.m. tomorrow." The customer paid an extra $250,000 plus interest and fees, and the guys in services got an extra 2 months to play Doom. With the reshipment delays on the order, they didn't get their machines for 4 weeks.